This is a story about how a Corvette C6 literally changed my life. This video looks back at the last 6 years of incredible adventures that I've enjoyed in the Corvette. It's taken me all the way across the States, around Europe, and even down into North Africa and the Sahara Desert. These adventures have led on to a series of children's books called Clive the Corvette. Clive led me to 2 championship victories in Scotland. He's been driven by a Formula One driver, and the first trip that we did across the US actually inspired the name of my young son, who was born some years later. As you can probably tell, I live in England and Corvettes are pretty rare over here. So when we were on vacation back in 2016, just had to ask for a passenger ride at Laguna Seca. The noise and the look and the feel of it just got under my skin. So later that evening, I started to have a look at adverts and was amazed at how such good value these C6s were. We said, wouldn't it be great to buy a car and drive it across the States and bring it back? Over the next 10 months or so, I just kept an eye out for C6 that I could actually afford, and eventually I found this one for sale. Paid $9,995 for it, unseen from a forum advert. Luckily for me, the car was fantastic and the seller, Jay, was both honest and described the car perfectly. It was fantastic. You'd never know it had 190,000 miles on it. From California, we drove through Arizona, Utah, up into Colorado, down to New Mexico, and carried on. We saw some breathtaking sights, as you can see from the video. Ourselves in Texas and a track day at Circuit of the Americas in Austin, and some years later, when my first and only son was born, we actually named him Austin after this memorable trip. We temporarily said goodbye to the Corvette at Houston, left it with the shipping agent, and then we took a flight to Tennessee and drove up to Kentucky to go and visit the Corvette Museum. I had no idea at that stage that years later I would have written a Corvette children's book and that it would receive General Motors approval to be sold in the Corvette store. It took around 3 months to get the car shipped back to the UK, about another month or so for me to make all the necessary changes to get it legal here in Europe. I knew I was going to use the car on track, so I started just little by little adding a few modifications, things like sump baffles and an oil cooler, and then soon realised that the base suspension was pretty soft, so needed to make some modifications to the dampers and stiffer leaf springs and so on. my cars myself, so when we moved house I actually built a carport shelter and installed a low-level lift to help me with all the maintenance. After 7 or 8 really fun track days around the country and over to Germany, I came home and noticed this irregular ticking noise. Thought it was probably a lifter, and sure enough there was one of the lifters was a bit rough, but I was rather alarmed to see that the cam chain tensioner had actually broken up, and these are the parts that you can see in the sump, so I think I got really lucky that no serious damage was done. But I couldn't blame the car. By this stage it had done about 200,000 miles and I'd given it quite a bit of thrashing on the track. More European trips followed, over to France for the wonderful Le Mans 24 Hour, then down to southern Spain through the mountains. Whilst I stay ahead of routine maintenance, I continue to be impressed with just how strong and reliable the Corvette is, considering how hard it's been used. It has never really let me down, and I put a lot of that down to the quality of build and design, particularly of the LS engine, but perhaps also because I've changed a few things whilst I've been in there, and I've also kept the power more or less the same. It's still producing close to the factory 400 horsepower. And finally, to finish it off, I had some stripes applied. Formula One driver and TV pundit Karun Chandok had seen the Clive the Corvette books for sale, bought a copy for his son. He loved it so much I offered to bring Clive there, and our sons got together and Karun took Clive and his son out for a drive. In 2021 I drove an entire season of a competition called Superlap Scotland. It finished every single one with no issues apart from a cracked wheel in the very final round.
As he goes through, he makes his way down through Butchers up towards McIntyre's, and this is where the Corvette really comes into its own. It can drive through this next couple of corners of the track all the way up the hill.
I track the Corvette as often as I can, and it's still my daily driver. Drive it in all conditions. The pictures I've used in the Clive the Corvette books are all photos I've taken myself from the different places that the Corvette has been. The next adventure certainly was an epic. With the help of a friend of mine, Felix, who also owns a C6, a convertible in Wales, we embarked out on a long trip down to North Africa through and into Morocco, having driven across Spain, and we went over the high Atlas Mountains, saw snow, ended up in the Sahara Desert where I got stuck. We rode camels, saw snakes, and just the most fantastic people. to the third book, Clive Drives to Africa. All three Clive the Corvette books are for sale right now from the National Corvette Museum store. You can also buy them online, of course. I know I'm biased, but I think they make a good present for a child, and the sale of every single book just helps me a little bit keep the Corvette going and keep the adventures coming in. The next trip we have planned will be the longest journey I would have ever taken, of between 4,000 to 5,000 miles of driving, heading north through 8 different European countries to reach the Arctic Circle. Yokohama and Liqui Moly are very kindly sponsoring and supporting this trip to the Arctic. So please help me out, buy a Clive the Corvette book or two, and like this video and subscribe to the channel.